ありがとうございます。防衛研究所地域研究部の山口と申します。私は中国の研究をしておりまして、この度のフリードバーグ先生のこのコンテスト・フォー・スプリマシーの中では中国に関する分析のパートを翻訳しております。で中国研究者から見ましてもフリードバーグ教授の議論というのは非常に読む価値がある非常に重要なものであると考えております。特にですね、先ほど佐橋先生からもお話がございましたが、先生は非常に議論をするのは非常にうまいと。で特に問題の設定というものに関して非常に優れていると思います。常に我々の思考をですね刺激してくれるというそうした研究をなされていると思います。で特にこのコンテスト・フォー・スプリマシーについてはですね、日本語以外にも韓国語、中国語は台湾とあと本土の方ですね、すみません、人民共和国の方でも出ているということで、非常にアジアにおいてアジアの安全保障の研究において非常に重要な著作であるというふうに考えます。で中身に入りますと、私はフリードバーグ先生のお話を聞いてですね、3つのモデルというお話がございましたが、私自身の考えでいきますと、私は第3のモデルが一番自分の考え方に近いと思っております。というのはですね、これは非常に重要な問題なんですけれども、第2のモデル、中国の国内要因が中国の行動を決定しているというですね、見方がございます。でこれは確かに非常に重要でして、でもちろんそれは完全に否定することはできないでしょう。社会的な不安ですとか、あるいは、共産党指導部の、政策決定が非常にばらけてきているというような議論が見られるわけであります。でしかしながらこうした議論というのは、私の考えでは若干検討が足りない部分というのがあるようにも思われるわけであります。といいますのはつまり社会的な不安が対外的な行動につながるというのはですね、もしそういう構図が存在するのであればとするならば、その共産党の体制というのは非常に脆弱かつものすごく弱々しいものであるということを意味するように思われます。しかしながら、実際問題、その中国共産党の政権自体が、指導者がですね危機を感じるような事態には陥っていないと、そうした事態にはないんではないかということが考えられるためであります。よってどうもその国内的な要因というのはあまり大きく見るのはちょっと私は問題があるのではないかというふうに考えるわけであります。で少し長くなってしまいますけれど、で3番目の点が私がどちらかというと支持するというそのことの理由はですね、現在のその中国の行動ですとか、あるいは発言、中国から出てくる発言というのを見てますと、やはり例えばですね、今現在中国は海洋に関して東シナ海や南シナ海などでさまざまな問題さまざまな紛争を引き起こしているわけですけれども、そこで中国が使っているロジックあるいは行動を見ますと、明らかにですねアメリカの介入を防ぎながら自分の利益を拡大していくという、それがおそらく中国の基本にあるんではないかと思われてくるわけであります。と言いますのは、中国は公船、政府の船ですねを使って、政府の船を使って、領土などに関して、自分の主張を強めようとしてくると。でこれのこうした行動の裏にあるのはおそらくですね、そうした政府船などを使った拡大という行動がですね、アメリカの介入を引き起こさないという計算があるんであろうと。そうでなければそうした行動は起こせないはずであるということからして、やはり私は第3番目の見方が非常に印象的でありました。でこれに関してちょっと先生はニトさんはどちらもあり得るということでしたけども、そこに関して先生のお考えをもう一度ちょっとお聞きできればと思います。以上です。
私は国際政治学をやっておりますので、特に今日のお話の中でフリードバーグ先生あまり触れられなかった日本とアメリカについて、ごく簡単にですが質問をしておきたいと思います。冒頭に私の方からご紹介しましたように、フリードバーグ先生の最初のご研究は第一次大戦前の イギリスのをめぐる国際政治の分析だったんですが、今日のお話は大変リーズナブルで、ポリシープレスクリプションどうすべきかということもそれ自身としては非常にテキストブック的に正解だと思うんですが、第一次大戦前のヨーロッパの事態を考えていても、そのテキストブックを現実に当てはめるというのは非常に難しいというふうに思います。そしてそれは今の日本にも当てはまることではないかなというのは私の感想でした。第一次大戦前のヨーロッパでは、単純によって、衰えつつあるイギリス、大国イギリスと、それから勃興するドイツという2つの大国の間で、力の変化が起きつつあったわけですが、それが最終的に第一次大戦という、不幸な大戦争に至ったわけですが、それがなぜ回避できなかったかということについては、今に至るまで、歴史家、国際政治学者は結論、合意に至っていないと思います。単純によって、戦争が始まるきっかけになったのは、2つの要因があったと思います。一つはバルカンで、オーストリア帝国とロシア帝国が張り合っていた、そしてオーストリアをドイツが支援をしていた。そのオーストリアとロシアの張り合いの中で、オーストリアがある種ドイツの後押しを当てにして、過剰に攻撃的な姿勢を取った、そこから抜き差しならない対立に陥っていったという、そういうモデル、そういう側面が一つあります。もう一つの要因はベルギーです。戦争の開始の時に、ドイツはベルギーの中立を犯して、フランスに攻撃をかけようとしました。そのベルギーは小国なので、ベルギーの安全というのは、イギリス、フランスが守るということが暗黙の了解だったんですけれども、最後の最後までイギリスははっきりとベルギーを守る、あるいはドイツの侵略に対抗するということは言いませんでした。それは国際政治学でいうところのいわゆるコミットメントの不足だったわけであります。非常に単純にもちろん言ってるわけですが、第一次大戦で、イギリスとドイツの間で戦争が回避できなかったのは、ある種そのドイツがオーストリアに対して、過剰にコミットメントをしすぎたという側面と、それからイギリスがベルギーに対するコミットメントが不足していたという点と、2点を指摘できると思うんですが、今の日米関係で、それはどういうふうに考えることができるのか。ご存知通り、尖閣でも対立があります。あるいは経済的にもナショナリズム、歴史の問題でも日米間で、関係が緊張する局面があります。それに対してアメリカはどのようなスタンスを取ることが最も望ましいと言えるのか、少し私の議論に引き込んで、その歴史のことを少し言い過ぎたかもしれませんけれども、フリードバーグ先生のお考えを聞きたいと思います。もう一つ簡単にアメリカについてお尋ねをしたいと思います。皆さんご承知のとおり、先日、米中間で非常に長時間の首脳会談がカリフォルニアで行われました。これはもちろんそれの内容についていろいろな観測がなされていますけれども、アメリカとして、フリードバーグ先生が最後におっしゃった、中国に対して、誤ったメッセージをシグナルを送らないように、強い姿勢を維持していくというふうな意思を示したものというふうに解釈できるのかどうかということであります。とりわけアメリカは大規模な軍事費を含めた財政の削減、それから国内政治上、非常に激しい分裂、民主党、共和党、両派の分裂というのが収まる見込みがありません。 そういう中で、アメリカが先生がおっしゃっているような強い姿勢というのを中国に維持し続けることが意思と能力両面において可能だとお考えかどうか、この点ももちろん大問題なので、本当にお答えいただくには大変時間がかかると思うんですが、大変恐縮ですけれども、ごく簡単に結論を教えていただければということで、お尋ねをする次第であります。
Okay. I will do my best to be succinct. Professors usually have a hard time being succinct. So let me take the questions as I understood them in order. I think the point that Dr. Yamaguchi is making, if I understand him correctly, is that the nuance and, if you like, the subtlety or modulation of Chinese behavior suggests a strategic rationality. And I'm inclined actually to agree with that. I don't think that they're simply charging forward on all fronts in a way that would suggest they're ignoring external factors. That isn't to say that these domestic mechanisms are not at work. And it may be that, as I said, which is never a very satisfying answer to say that both are present, but it probably is true. The question is sort of what's the balance between the two? It's conceivable that over time, the rationality and nuance and subtlety of the policy could diminish. So maybe they're still able to do this and control it, but perhaps over time that will become less the case. One thing I would say is there is a tendency, I think, on the part of outside observers, or at least I noticed this in the United States, to always look for, if not benign, then less worrisome explanations for Chinese behavior. And one of these has been, in recent years, whenever China does something that we don't like, testing an anti-satellite weapon or demonstrating a stealth aircraft or taking the steps that it has in the South China Sea, people will say, well, but that's not really what the central leadership wants. This is the military, or this is the fisheries ministry, and so on. And the Chinese leadership, I think, encourages that in a way, responding by saying, well, you can't blame us. But I don't think that that's accurate. I think if you step back from the details and look at the overall pattern, you still see coherence, which suggests to me underlying strategic rationality. So I don't disagree with you. On the question of the analogy to the First World War is very interesting. I won't dwell on that as much as I am fascinated by the question of the First World War. So let me talk briefly about the question of the U.S. stance on the Senkakus. And there are people who have said that the United States needs to be careful about giving too strong a commitment to Japan, because perhaps Japan will do things that will drag it into a conflict with China. Although it is in theory conceivable that that could happen, and you could imagine the provocative or aggressive things that Japan might do, it seems to me quite unlikely. I think the real danger is that China will make a mistake about the extent of the American commitment to Japan on the Senkakus issue, that they'll misunderstand what our intentions are, or believe that there might be some gap between us on this issue. And for that reason, I think the policies that have been followed by the Obama administration are essentially the right ones. So rhetorically, to make very clear that the Senkakus are different than the other maritime disputes, because in the American view, the Senkakus were placed or returned to Japanese administrative control after being controlled by the United States in the early 1970s, and therefore, from the American point of view, they're covered under the Mutual Security Treaty. I think saying that is important. I also think that we have to do more than just say this, and we have to do things that demonstrate the seriousness of our resolve. So the military exercises that were held recently off the coast of California, that's an example of a carefully modulated gesture. Doing it on the Senkakus might have been overly provocative. We picked the spot that was furthest away from China, but of course the Chinese got the message that the United States and Japan are thinking about and preparing for contingencies in which China might take aggressive action. So I don't worry about encouraging Japan to behave in a reckless fashion by backing it strongly. I worry more about the opposite danger. Now that leads to the second question of whether the United States really can take a strong stance, in particular in light of our budget difficulties. Let me make first an overall comment and then maybe a more specific one. The overall comment is that I think it's a mistake for people to believe the rhetoric that one hears from some people in the US and also from people in China about the United States being in a sort of state of terminal decline. You mentioned the book that I wrote in the 1980s, and that was a response to the debate that was going on then about US decline. And what happened? Well, within about 10 years, people were talking about the unipolar world. That was an exaggeration, and so too was the fear of decline. I think if you look at the problems the United States has now, they're problems of liquidity, not inadequate resources. And they can be dealt with by making compromises that bring expenditures and tax revenues more closely into balance. You point out correctly that our two political parties can't seem to agree on how best to do that, and that's true, but I predict with some confidence that ultimately they will. It is a battle that's going to go on for a while. That's the nature of the American political system. But when they do, and even in a sense, this is happening already, the deficit is, or debt is going down as a portion of GDP. The deficit will close as growth picks up. There are many reasons to have confidence in the resilience of the American economy, not least the discovery of energy in shale, which I think is going to transform the global energy picture and be an enormous boost to the U.S. economy. The fundamentals are very much in favor of a healthy recovery and long-term growth. And in my view, there's no question that we can sustain the effort that's necessary to maintain a balance in this region, especially if we do so in collaboration with our allies. By contrast, I don't think it's at all clear that China is going to stay on anything resembling the current trajectory. In fact, in my view, the question is not whether China's growth will slow down, but how rapidly it will slow down. And it seems to me there are two possibilities. One is gradually, and the other is precipitously. And I don't know which it is, but I think there are a number of serious observers, an increasing number of serious observers, who believe that it may slow down quite rapidly. And if that happens, China's ability to sustain the kind of military buildup that it's engaged in will be less. So we shouldn't anticipate this inevitable rise of China and the inevitable decline of the United States. I think the Chinese would like us to believe that that's the way the world is going to be, but I don't think we should buy it, and we shouldn't act as if we believed it. Now, that said, in the near term and medium term, we have real constraints. We're going to make significant cuts in defense spending. If there isn't a ready or rapid resolution of the budget deadlock, we're going to make even bigger cuts, and that will damage our posture, our military posture in this part of the world. So I don't want to understate the seriousness of that. But I think in any event, it's more important than it's perhaps ever been, certainly than it's been since the end of the Cold War, for the United States and Japan in particular to coordinate our efforts to make sure that we make efficient use of our resources because together we can, I think, quite effectively maintain a balance. But we're not doing this as efficiently and effectively as we could right now, in part because of the peculiar character of our alliance. And of course, this raises all sorts of questions about collective self-defense. But it's one of the reasons why I, and I think many others in the United States, believe that the general direction of the policies of the current Japanese administration are desirable. The move towards recognition of the ability of Japan to engage in collective self-defense, an inclination to increase defense spending. Those, from an American point of view, I think are desirable policies because they will help to maintain a balance even in a period when the United States is somewhat constrained. Well, of course, there are two answers to that question. One is if I were a politician, I would say, of course, it would be much better in every respect, and everything would be wonderful, and we would have the perfect relationship with China. The real answer is I have no idea, and of course, we'll never know. This would be political science fiction. Let me say two things. One, just broadly, as you suggested, I think actually if you look at the history of the last 20 years, the China policy pursued by the United States under Republican and Democratic administration has been more similar than different. And I make this point in the book, as you know, that basically we've been pursuing this mixed or blended strategy where we're trying to maintain a balance but also to engage. And the differences are more degree than fundamentals. And I think that that will continue to be true and would have been true under a Romney administration. So that's the broad answer. I don't think there would be radical changes. But of course, even relatively minor changes can be significant. And that gets to the issue of what would have happened if Romney had been elected. And again, I repeat, I don't know. And one of the reasons I don't know is because although I was involved in the campaign, I don't really know what the composition of a Romney administration would have been like. And this is perhaps the more important point, there are significant differences of opinion within the Republican Party, to some degree the Democratic Party, but I think they may be sharper now in the Republican Party over China policy. And you have, on the one hand, Henry Kissinger and some major commercial interests as well, Brent Scowcroft, very strong advocates of engagement, very concerned about provoking China unnecessarily and so on. On the other hand, you have people like me who are quite worried about whether we're doing enough on the balancing front, and you have people who are even further out than me who think you know, a war with China is inevitable and all sorts of what I think are kind of crazy things. So what would the composition of an administration have been like? Would one camp or the other have been dominant? Would you have had kind of internal warfare between those groups and perhaps an incoherent mess of policy? I don't know. I guess, as I said, we'll never know for sure, but those issues are still with us, and they will be present in the next Republican administration, and I think have yet to be resolved, whether there will be a change. Well, thank you. That's a very, I think, important and profound question that we don't yet know the answer to. But if you believe that economic interdependence is a force for peace, and the more interdependence there is, the better it is, let's just assert that. I think it's actually the world is more complicated than that. And if you think that China is actually going to move in the direction that many outsiders, many Americans urge that it move, its dependence on other countries for capital, its dependence on exports as the primary motive for economic growth, are going to diminish. It's going to have a bigger internal market. Consumption is going to become more important as a driver for economic growth. It's going to have a more developed financial system and more capital available for investment. So it may be that China's dependence in that sense on the advanced industrial countries has passed its peak. And that might mean, as you suggest, that perhaps interdependence will be less potent as a constraint. Now, having said that, I think it's also, of course, important to note that even if in relative terms China is less dependent than it's been, it's still going to be deeply engaged in the global economy first. The second point, and this leads to another discussion that perhaps we can have another day, is that even if China becomes, or as it becomes, somewhat less dependent on global markets for its goods and international sources of capital, it's going to become increasingly dependent on resources that are imported, in particular energy, but not only energy, food and other materials. Whether that will have a benign impact on its foreign policy or to the contrary, whether it might encourage China to behave in more aggressive ways in order to secure supplies of resources, we don't know. But I think some of what we're seeing in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, some of this assertiveness is driven by China's enormous thirst for energy and by the belief in China and elsewhere that underneath the surface of these waters lie vast reserves of oil and natural gas. So in this sense, the need for resources may be a motive force for more assertive behavior and perhaps for conflict. Your description of what is going on coincides with my own perception. That is that the shift in Japan in the last several years is the result of a greater feeling of external threat, and therefore a recognition, I think, more widely of the need for Japan to be stronger in order to secure itself and its own interests. My perception also is that some Japanese politicians have used, and I would say that this was true of Mr. Koizumi as well, have used the history issue to some extent to mobilize popular support, as you say, but also I think because they believe that it's necessary for Japan to somehow step out from under the umbrella or the cloud of guilt that's associated with World War II in order to be a more normal nation. And I understand that calculation from a pragmatic point of view, but I do worry about it, not so much, not at all, because I think somehow this is going to lead to return to Japanese militarism or anything like that, but more because the use of these issues to mobilize political support domestically isolates Japan and intensifies tensions between Japan and other countries, and in particular between Japan and countries with whom it ought to share both values and interests, like South Korea. The way in which history is sometimes discussed by Japanese political figures does damage, frankly, to Japan's international reputation, causes tension with other countries, and doesn't help the relationship with the United States either. The only people who gain when Japanese politicians say some of the things that they've said in recent years are the Chinese, because it isolates Japan, as I said. So I won't offer advice on how best to deal with that, just to observe that this is a problem.